Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this installment of Chop It Up NC. Tonight, our guest is running for state treasurer. His name is Gabe Esparza. Gabe, how are you doing this evening? I think you might be muted.
How about now?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, again, Reverend, thank you for doing this tonight. It's good to see you. Look forward to the conversation tonight.
All right. We've got a slew of questions. We've got some people in the audience listening to us tonight. And as we've already briefed you prior to starting this recording, others will be watching this recording. And so I want to remind all of you who are in the audience tonight, if you could keep your audio muted, because we don't want to hear a lot of background noise, that would be helpful to us as we have this conversation with this outstanding candidate for state treasurer. It's good to see you tonight, and we've had several conversations over the phone, and I've been eagerly waiting for this conversation because we've been talking now for at least one full month. And I would have you know that you have supporters all across this state who've been telling me since September, you've got to meet and talk to Gabe. So finally,
here we are.
Yes, here we are. So tell us about who you are, your origin story, family, parents, where you grew up, background in general, Gabe.
Very good. Always a good place to start on origin stories. So in addition to telling you where I grew up, I'll give you a little bit of the family story in that knowing our history, knowing where our lineage comes from is an important part of identity. And when we think about our identity and ourselves, that is made up of generations and generations and generations of family. And so mine come from two different paths. I'll start with my father's path. His is Mexican and a Mexican-American family. Our family, the Esparza family, lived in a little town in the state of Jalisco, Mexico, for over 300 years. The little town is named Encarnación de Díaz. People might be familiar with the city's name, Guadalajara, a bigger city in Mexico, and it's a few hours north of that. And there my family was for literally hundreds and hundreds of years until the Mexican Revolution. The 19 teens and early 1920s disrupted so much in Mexico at that time. And for those of you who are familiar with the stories of the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa and all of the characters during that time, it caused an enormous amount of upheaval and indeed triggered what became one of the largest mass migrations around the globe, and in this case, Mexicans coming to the United States. And that included my family. On my mom's side of the family, and this will sound radically different than what I just told you, my mom is of Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish descent. And similarly, like so many Jews in the United States, it is a story of persecution and challenge in, luckily for my family, pre-World War II Europe, but still a challenging time that caused the upheaval, and in the case of my family, the Golds and the Rosens, to come from Ukraine and Poland through New York to the United States, where ultimately my two sides of the family merged in Los Angeles. And my Mexican Catholic father and my Eastern European Jewish mother got together in LA in the 1960s. And like the 1960s, there's my mom in a white miniskirt, Jewish girl from the Valley marrying a Mexican guy. And that is the United States, and that is my story. My father, amazingly enough, was going to be a priest. And he was the oldest of 12 kids, grew up being an altar boy all his life, and decided he wanted to be a priest, went to the seminary, graduated from the seminary. And it was at that moment in which he approached the bishop. And he said, Bishop, I would like to continue my education beyond the seminary and get a master's degree in social work or psychology or something, because when you are there in front of the flock, in front of the parish, and you are teaching scripture, at the same time, you are helping people with their problems. And so I would like to be better at that and get a graduate degree in social work. And unfortunately for my father, fortunately for me, the bishop said, no, I want you to start your priesthood today. And yet my father said, well, wait a second. I have, beyond being a good student in the seminary, I have lived a life working in the fields. My father grew up picking oranges in the orange groves, as did he and his 12 brothers and sisters, sort of classic big Mexican Catholic immigrant farm worker story. And his father, my abuelito, Guadalupe Esparza, said to him, the way out of the fields, the way out of a life of simply picking fruit is through education. And through education, we gain our freedom. And so when my father was faced with somebody telling him, I'm going to stop you getting more education, he said, that doesn't sound right to me. And so he made the enormous life decision, again, good for me, to leave the priesthood, leave the seminary after he had graduated, chose not to be ordained, and went to do what, in this case, many ex-priests do, which is join the world of social services, human services, psychology. And so he went to get his master's degree in social work at the University of California, Los Angeles, while he was working for the LA County Department of Social Services. And it was a year into his tenure when his boss came to him and said, Ricardo, my dad's name is Ricardo. Ricardo, I want you to train the new lady, Sue Gold, who is joining us today. And that's my mom. That's how my parents met. Now, my father, after getting his master's degree, was approached by the Ford Foundation. Many in the audience will know that in the 60s and early 70s, there were virtually no Black or brown PhD candidates. And thank God for the Ford Foundation, because they approached my dad and they said, we want to pay for you to get a PhD. And so my dad ultimately was enrolled in the PhD program at the University of Michigan. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the University of Michigan, because my dad was there getting his PhD. And ultimately he graduated and became the first Latino to get a PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan. And so my dad is the one who broke the barriers. And together with my mom, started a life in social work and psychology. And my dad ultimately got a job in Boulder, Colorado, where I had the great pleasure of growing up the entirety of my childhood, kindergarten through high school, all in Colorado. So that's my origin story. Mexican roots, Eastern European Jewish roots, a psychologist, a social worker, somebody who had worked in the fields, broke barriers, and gave a loving, warm household to me and my one brother, Nicolas. And so that's the origin story.
That's a compelling story. Wow. Well, first of all, Gabe, I used to live in Michigan. I used to live in Ann Arbor.
Go Blue.
Yes, well, but I also lived in Ohio, so
You're conflicted.
so I'm conflicted. I was just watching, and this is not what we're supposed to be talking about, but this is conversational too. I was just watching repeatedly the story of Cesar Chavez, and I can't help but want to ask you what your parents thought of him as a human being, as a leader, and how might his leadership and influence sort of meant something to you as someone who knew that story well.
It's amazing that you asked me that question. for so many reasons. Number one is my dad and my familia were working in the fields at the dawn of the United Farm Workers movement and the Cesar Chavez movement. Okay. And I have pictures of me as a kid wearing pins that said UFW, Chicanos, Brown Power, Huelga, which means boycott in Spanish, boycott grapes, boycott lettuce, all of those things that were the Cesar Chavez movement, the Brown Power movement, the United Farm Worker, the dawn of the United Farm Worker movement. That was my family. And it was in 8th grade, growing up in Colorado, that my history professor or teacher assigned my class, do a biography on an important person in history. And he came up to me and he said, Gabe, it might be fun for you to do a biography on Cesar Chavez. And so I wrote my biography on Cesar Chavez. And then 2 things subsequent to that have been life-changing for me. Number one is when I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, I had the great honor to meet Cesar Chavez, Cesar Chavez, who came to campus and spoke with the Mexican-American students and talked to us about the legacy of organizing, the legacy of advocating, and all the good work that he and Dolores Huerta did in organizing Mexicanos, Mexican Americans, Latinos, including, by the way, Filipinos, African Americans, other communities of color who were in support and coalition with Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And so I had the great honor of meeting him. And today, I call his granddaughter, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, a friend. And for those of you who don't know, Julie Chavez Rodriguez is the campaign manager for a certain President Biden in his reelection for president. And so she and I are friends. She is running his reelection campaign. Cesar Chavez's granddaughter. You see how life is a circle. And the influence that Cesar Chavez was for me as a kid, and now I am friends with his granddaughter as she runs the president's reelection campaign. It couldn't get any better than that.
Wow. Incredible. Incredible. So you went to Stanford, and from Stanford, well, what did you major in when you were at Stanford before you started your career, which seems to have mostly been in the private sector?
Yes, not everyone has the privilege to be able to go to college at all, let alone a place like Stanford. And so I count myself as so fortunate to have been able to attend Stanford University, where I studied double major. I got 1 degree in international relations and 1 degree, don't laugh, in psychology. Yes, somewhat influenced by my father and my parents working in social work and psychology. I knew I didn't want to be a clinician, but the understanding the human mind, understanding what makes people tick, understanding human relations was something that I wanted to study. And of course, in tandem, studied international relations, which is the combination, an interdisciplinary degree of history, government, and economics. And so that's what I studied as an undergraduate. And then I presume you'll follow that with a question on, did I stop there or continue my education? And indeed, I continued my education and once again had the great privilege to go to Harvard University for my MBA. And I'm going to tell you, if I may, Reverend, one absolutely amazing story of my time at Harvard. This is an institution that you will know and your listeners will know is 400 years old, older than the nation itself. And the term convocation is the bringing together of the entire university in one place, typically for graduation, right? Typically to celebrate the current class graduating. There have only been, was it 2 or 3 other, 2 other occasions? Yes, 2 other occasions in which the university had been brought together as a convocation outside of graduation. And so the president of the university called a convocation when I was in my first year there. This is 1998. Brought everybody together. Everybody is there in Centennial Yard, Harvard Yard. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, we are here today outside of the realm of the graduation for only the third time in history. What brings us together today? Well, let me remind you that the first time we came together in convocation was to honor the recently retired President George Washington. The second time we came together was to honor one of the statesmen of World War II, Mr. Winston Churchill. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we are here for only the third time in the 400-year history of Harvard. And I present to you Mr. Nelson Mandela, who walked out on stage. And even to this day, right, it just brings tears to you to think what that man did, what he went through becoming president of South Africa after decades of pain and suffering and bondage, and freed his people. That was my introduction to Harvard a month into my time there. It was absolutely fabulous. So yes, I am so privileged to have gone to those two schools.
You are privileged in many senses, and we'll talk about your career in just a moment, but the people with whom your life has intersected, Cesar Chavez, Nelson Mandela, Stanford, Harvard, Michigan. Some would say those are probably the absolute best schools, not just in the country, but certainly in their regions, in their respective regions.
And yet here we are in a state in which at least our post-secondary school system, the University of North Carolina system, Duke University, all of the amazing institutions that we have here are contrasted with what is a very challenged K through 12 system in our state. And I hope we have a chance to discuss that, but it does bring to me the contrast of where I've had the great privilege to attend. And today, not only do I encounter the great state of North Carolina's fabulous education system at the post-secondary level, yet all the challenges we have in the K through 12 level. And my contribution to that effort today in terms of education is as trustee of Central Piedmont Community College here in Charlotte. And so we'll talk about education, but I continue to believe that education equals freedom. And therefore, the more education you have, the better education you have, the equality of education is tantamount to the opportunities that life will afford us. And so I hope to be a part of the story of making North Carolina as good as it can get from an education standpoint.
So I'm going to throw a curveball at you because I know you can handle curveballs.
Yes.
You're a very brilliant man. You're running for the office of state treasurer. That position, that person also sits on the state board of education.
That's right.
And yet you have all of this tremendous corporate background and life experience. How do you see the intersection between education and what's happening in society from a corporate perspective? Is there any avenue for education to advance independent of corporate influence or corporate money? And not only that, since you've had this wonderful experience in the private sector, how do you see the private sector enhancing and improving educational opportunities, not just for a privileged few, but for everyone? How do you see how all of these things fit together?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And education, as I said, education equals freedom. The more education you have, the more freedom you have to choose what you want to do in your life. And yet, a traditional four-year education, whether that's at a spectacular state institution like the University of North Carolina, private institutions, what have you, or here in Charlotte at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, that is not the path in life for everyone. There are many paths in life. And what we need to do as a society is value that path, which is the traditional four-year college path, but we need to value other paths equally. And that can be going into the military, that can be starting to work right away, that can be because you got to take care of your family, right? That can be going to a community college. And I mentioned a moment ago that I have the great honor of being a trustee at Central Piedmont Community College. That is actually the predominant place in society where the nexus of workforce development and academia come together. Because while some people go to a traditional four-year college and earn a degree which might or might not translate to their ultimate employment, the reality is that the vast majority of our society just needs to go get a job and start to work. And if the needs of the private sector, from a business standpoint, from a job standpoint, from a supply of employment standpoint, doesn't find the connection with what is being taught in our schools, K through 12, and again at our community colleges, then we're missing that cross point, that nexus. And so I'm very proud of the work that we're doing at Central Piedmont, as well as throughout the 58 colleges, community colleges throughout North Carolina, where we are identifying and then matching what is being taught to what needs to get done in the workforce. And I'll give you a few examples, somewhat unique to Central Piedmont, but generally what's going on in our community college. Today you have electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are slowly but surely displacing and perhaps eventually replacing traditional combustion engine motor vehicles. And so for decades and decades and decades, community colleges like Central Piedmont have had mechanics programs to teach the practical skill of mechanics. And we had one student who graduated from Central Piedmont, and instead of taking traditional mechanics, he took a little bit more electronics and engineering, and ultimately went to work for Tesla. And Tesla said, we don't have engines here, we have batteries, we have computer systems that run these cars, and you seem to be quite adept at knowing how to fix them and make them and so forth. How can we find more people like you? And he said, well, them thinking he must have graduated from MIT or some fancy technical university. No, he goes, I got a fabulous degree from Central Piedmont Community College. And Tesla said, well, we need to clone you, rinse and repeat. Let's do that over and over again. And so instead of just saying, let's start creating that degree, Central Piedmont and Tesla came together to create a program that was sponsored by Tesla and would generate X number of graduates every year that were well-versed in electric vehicle mechanics, those particularly unique to Tesla, and were guaranteed a job on the coming out of it. If that, to me, if that's not the definition of how our education should be in sync with our workforce and with our supplier base and our private sector jobs, that is perfect. And we're doing that over and over and over again with Duke Energy, with Honeywell, with by the way, including state government and local county government and city government, where if you did not finish your degree and wanted to go back and finish your degree while you're a city employee or a county employee, the city and the county in Central Piedmont came together to offer that continuing education opportunity. So over and over again. And lastly, because I brought up my pride in being bilingual and bicultural, Central Piedmont, like so many community colleges and universities, is making an extra effort to reach out to and educate Latinos in not only English as a second language, but in professional English and in how to be a bilingual teacher, how to be a bilingual nurse, how to, all of these things which are important to our society. Because as Charlotte grows and more Spanish-speaking people come here, the services will be required, whether it's a summer camp counselor, a social worker, a Red Cross volunteer, all of these people being bilingual will be important to add to our mix in order to take care of all the great people of Charlotte and Mecklenburg and North Carolina.
Okay, so very quickly, your career in the private sector, because we want to get on to why you're running for treasurer and the goals that you have for the state of North Carolina. You've done a lot in Charlotte, we know, and you understand the needs of Charlotte, and we appreciate that tremendously. But just tell me a little bit about your career, and then let's talk about why you're running for the office of state treasurer.
Okay, so 25 years in the private sector. Between college and graduate school, I worked for the Walt Disney Company. I said, I don't want to sit in a cube in corporate headquarters and be a spreadsheet guy. I want to be out there on the front line. And they said, great, we're sending you to Walt Disney World. So I worked in Orlando for a few years as a guest service manager at Epcot. And for those of you who don't know, Mickey's a Teamster. And so we had a great opportunity to see every possible management interaction and situation that you can imagine. Had a great time organizing the Latino employees. In fact, I'll tell you that what is today, let's see, this was 1995, 1996. We created the Hispanic Employee Network of Epcot. That became the Hispanic Employee Network of Walt Disney World. That later became the Hispanic Employee Resource Group of the entire Walt Disney Company. So you're looking at yours truly, the founder of the Hispanic Employee Resource Group of the Walt Disney Company back in the early 90s. So that was a great time there for a few years in Orlando. And then after business school, had a couple of years working in consulting, but the preponderance of my career, the majority of my career, is in financial services, and specifically at American Express. Spent 13 years at American Express, both in the small business division and then in the big corporate payments division as well. 13 years advocating for small businesses, doing strategic planning, marketing, sales, you name it, everything across the board during those 13 years. Then in 2015, 2016, I started to do, in tandem with my wife, a little bit of what we call angel investing, right? I'll put some of my personal money to work investing in some startups and some entrepreneurial ventures. And one of those was a company by the name of Rapid SOS that proposed to change and radically alter the nation's 911 system. And this is because up until 2018, if you called 911 but were unable to either speak English or in the moment of your panic, remember your address, then 911 didn't have a good way of finding you. And thousands of people were dying every year simply because they couldn't be found. And this to us had such an obvious fix, because today, you know, there are two companies that know exactly where you are, whether you like it or not. For those of you who have iPhones, Apple knows exactly where you are. For those of you who have Android phones, Google knows exactly where you are, to about a range of 10 meters. And so we had to go get 2 deals done. We got those 2 deals done. And so we transformed the nation's 911 system to being that of a voice conversation with 911 to a data conversation in which the where are you is no longer necessary. We know exactly where you are. Just tell me what's going on, right? And so you see Walt Disney Company, management experiences, big customer service experiences, a little bit of consulting, then 13 years at American Express, what ended up being ultimately about 5 years in totality at this technology company, startup, transformational company, Rapid SOS. And that was my time in the private sector. So I'm guessing you'll ask me, how did I get into the public sector? But that was the 20 plus 5 years in the private sector, right?
You know, a lot of people don't see the correlation between private sector work and public sector service. But I think you've already alluded, quite frankly, to the origins of that public service mortality, or rather motif and mentality that you have. But again, feel free to share with us what was the trigger point for you to move from the private sector into public service?
So not only did I see the life that my parents led in being healthcare workers, in a way, while they were making a salary, that is a service oriented job. And it was my Spanish teacher, my madrina in high school, who also happened to be a teacher at my high school, who kicked me in the butt and said, "Hey, you know what? You're doing really well in school, but we've got all these immigrant kids, most of whom don't speak any English. You need to tutor them after school. You need to set up an organization that creates an opportunity for them to get a fair shake in school." And so I started that. That was high school, right? And part of that spirit of organizing kept with me over time. I told you I organized the Latino employees of the Walt Disney Company. When I went to Harvard Business School, there was no Latino Students Association. I started Latino Students Association at Harvard. At American Express, unfortunately, I lived through 9/11 in New York City at the time, which made, because the American Express Tower was right there downtown next to the World Trade Center. That building was out of commission for many years. It meant the Latino employee network of the American Express company sort of fall apart. I helped rekindle that. So the organizing, the advocating, the champion of people was something that I've been doing for a long time. And yet I had this day job, which was technology and payments and financial services. And there was a piece of it which was not fulfilling. And in fact, I had a realization around about 2012 in which I said, I could see the rest of my career at American Express. Another 15, 20 years, whatever it is, I'll move up the ladder. Heck, maybe I'll be even CEO someday. And I'll turn around and I'll look back on my career and say, what did I accomplish? I sold a lot of credit cards. And would I be fulfilled with that? And the answer was no. That started the process of dedicating my life, not just in a volunteer capacity, but in an actual career capacity to public service. The first point of that transition became going to work for this 911 company. Well, it was a startup and interesting, and yes, we wanted to make money. The mission was to save lives and aid our first responders in doing their jobs most effectively so that we could get there sooner and save lives. And so now we turn to 2020. And I'll talk a little bit about this, but I had worked in campaigns at the presidential level for many years, raising money amongst the Latino community, getting the Latino vote out, working on economic policy issues and so forth. And so I did that for President Biden's campaign in 2020, having done it for President Obama's campaign, Hillary Clinton's campaign. And it was after the 2020 victory that the president's team came to me, along with U.S. Small Business Administration Administrator Isabela Guzman, and said, we want you to come and work for the administration. And so I had the great privilege of working for our country as a senior official in the SBA the last 2 years in Washington, D.C., as the associate administrator of the Office of International Trade at that SBA. And so just a wonderful, wonderful experience to advocate for small business. And that was the final sort of formal transition to the public sector, having had a very happy and successful 25-year career in the private sector.
Well, let me say something here for those who may not understand. When you say associate administrator, having worked in the government, and you see someone's name with an AA beside it, you normally look at that person and say they have a tremendous amount of impact and influence in the way that entire organization is run. Would that be the case with you in the Small Business Administration?
Well, let's put it this way. My boss, Administrator Guzman, is a member of President Biden's cabinet, and I was a direct report to Administrator Guzman. There were 7 of us political appointees who ran the various operating units of the SBA, and I was one of those. Yes, sir.
Are you sure that being state treasurer is not a step down?
No, sir, not at all. It is the first difference, by the way, and I appreciate perhaps the humor in your question, but the first difference is it's wonderful to be appointed to office. And I'll tell you, in addition to what you've heard so far, being appointed to the federal government's political office, to being appointed as a trustee of Central Piedmont Community College. Prior to moving to North Carolina, living in Los Angeles, I was a commissioner, appointed commissioner in Los Angeles for 8 years. So I have local and federal government experience, albeit as an appointed official. This would be elected office, as you know. And so while surely the job at the SBA was a big office, a big important part of the SBA and the federal government, elected office is a different animal, A, because you have to run to get there, but you're not appointed by the president or the governor or your city council member, what have you. You are appointed / elected by the people. And so for somebody who is not only competitive by nature and wants to go win, but because you know that the only people you report to are the people, it's an empowering opportunity in a way that the others are not.
Mhm, mhm. Agreed. Agreed. So you're running for, having served in the Biden administration, acknowledging that there is this need and this craving for service and connecting with people, because this is what I'm picking up on as I'm talking to you. There are many things you could do. You could probably run Twitter at this point.
Maybe not.
But you're concerned about people enough to be willing to look at things like what's happening with education in the state, and we've already spoken about that. The Office of State Treasurer, you're looking at things like the state retirees pension fund, things that impact the way people live, what medicines they buy, how much gas they can put in their car, whether or not they can give their grandchildren a little something when they go off to college. Where does this drive come from to want to serve in this way?
Well, in this way, so I've told you what my inner motivation is. It's that Cesar Chavez. It's that education equals freedom. It is wanting to do right by the Latino community, all communities that haven't had a fair shake in life. And in thinking about what's next, and in being very pragmatic about which offices most align with my skill set and my interests, you'd think that the office most suited for a business person would be the office of the treasurer, right? So first and foremost, as somebody who has been an operator, somebody who has worked not only in the executive branch of government, but in the private sector, running businesses, starting businesses, running businesses, managing budgets, managing people, managing money, that it would most align with the office of the treasurer. Mm-hmm. And so that's my personal motivation for running for the office of treasurer. I will tell you the circumstances at the moment in the office of the treasurer and politically in the state also make it circumstantially the best office to go after at this moment. And so as those two things come together, I couldn't be more excited to pursue this opportunity to serve not only the state's employees, but retirees and all North Carolinians in ensuring that the state pension fund is as healthy and stable and providing that long-term prosperity to our retirees and their families. As well as you point out, the healthcare plan for the state and other interesting things that the treasurer touches, like the State Board of Education and matters of education. So it is the perfect job for me, and I'm all in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let me ask you this: since we're talking about the pension fund, is it in good shape at this point? Are we robbing from Peter to pay Paul? What's the and what would you suggest would be needed in order to further stabilize and protect that fund?
Right. So number one, Our pension fund is about 116, 117 billion dollars, managed solely by the treasurer. Okay, this is an enormously powerful position to have that much money. There's only one other pension fund in the United States, which is larger, New York Commons, that has more money managed by one individual. $116 billion managed by the treasurer, him or herself. Enormously powerful. What this treasurer, Dale Folwell, has done is to say, I'm going to be as risk averse and conservative as possible. As a result of which he is sitting on a $16 billion, $16 billion in cash. This is money that is not being put to work. And in fact, with inflation where it is money that is effectively losing its real value every day that goes by. It is an opportunity cost in some terms, but the average person would know it is if you put your money in the bank or put it under the mattress and you're not putting it to work, you're not investing it in whatever asset, whatever opportunity, whether it's buying a house, whether it is putting it in a savings account, whether it's putting it in an index fund, whether it's putting it in some super risky opportunity, whatever you're doing, you're putting it to work. You're giving your money an opportunity to grow, because we all know that interest through compound interest grows that money over time. And yet this treasurer is sitting on $16 billion in cash. It is not doing anything. In fact, it is effectively losing money. I would argue that this treasurer has lost North Carolinians hundreds of millions of dollars by not investing that money. That's issue number one. Issue number two, the amount of money every year that the pension fund needs to generate, needs to spin off to pay for the current retiree pension fund benefits is about 7.5%, 8% a year, right? The fund needs to generate about that much money to pay today's obligations. And this treasurer has decided to promise less and less and less quietly every year. He has promised the fund, he has promised the people less and less every year. But the obligations, right? What our hardworking retirees who put in decades of service to the state require is more than what he's promising. And so there's a gap. Who's filling up that gap as he lowers that field goal for himself, lowers the goalpost? Well, it's not the employee, today's state employee, it is today's state employer. It's the school, it's the hospital, it's the fire department, it is our state offices. They are shouldering the burden. But those are state institutions. Who funds those institutions? The taxpayers do. Mm-hmm. So this treasurer is effectively saying, I'm going to do worse, and I'm going to shift the burden onto you, the taxpayer, to make up for my underperformance. Mm-hmm. So not only is he not investing the money, he is pushing the burden of the performance of the fund onto the taxpayers to make up the difference for what he's unable to do. Two enormous challenges that, by the way, go unnoticed because people don't hear about what's going on in the treasurer's office. I hope to bring these issues to the forefront. That's the pension fund. We can talk about healthcare, we can talk about education, but that is the principal challenge with this fund. It needs to do better. And oh, by the way, the power of the pension fund to do good in North Carolina, to invest in things like affordable housing, to make sure that when we spend the money of the pension fund, that we think about good paying union jobs. We think about smart investments that not only have fabulous returns, but uphold the values of our state, our people, and our working families in order to maximize both the effectiveness of the fund and the impact of the fund as well.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. Let me open it up to the audience for just a moment. Do we have any questions? And as you think about this, I was reminded by Shante Anthony to make sure our audience knows, and those who will watch this later, that we are not endorsing a candidate tonight. We cannot do that, but we can certainly enjoy the pleasant conversation and acknowledge that. And so I can certainly say that this conversation has been thoroughly energizing for me. Even after a long day, you can tell I'm probably losing my voice a little bit. But this is the type of conversation, Gabe, that really attunes my hearing, because I'm interested in what's happening with our money, with housing, with education, and being able to see how all of these things intersect and what leadership can do to impact the lives of people. But
so let me give you the other important one, as perhaps either the audience thinks about questions or as you do as well. The other important, enormously important role of the state treasurer is to manage the state healthcare plan. And recently we've had a decision by this treasurer to do something pretty radical. And that was to change the insurance provider for our state employees and retirees. For the past 40 years, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina has been the state insurance provider. This treasurer made the decision and came up with a process that ultimately ended up getting rid of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And over the next year and a half, ramping in a new provider, that being Aetna. Now, for people who are aware of this change, on the surface, it feels a little suspect because, as you know, when the government issues a request for a proposal, typically the winner of that bid is the low-cost provider. In this case, Aetna was not the low-cost provider. In fact, it was more expensive with worse coverage, doctor coverage, than Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And so how is it that Aetna ended up winning? My point in this is not to say that we should relitigate the decision or change it immediately upon taking office. But it was a little bit of a questionable process and decision and outcome by this treasurer. Now, setting that aside, what is the reality of the situation? In January of 2025, Aetna will be the new healthcare insurance company of the state. And I say January of 2025 because it takes time to go through that transition. But you'll have to think about the scenario in which in January of 2025, a state employee or retiree goes to their doctor and says, I need a checkup, I need this or that. And their doctor says, I'm sorry, I used to take Blue Cross Blue Shield, but I don't take Aetna. You're out of luck. And there are going to be potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands, of hardworking North Carolinians and retirees who are unable to get their health care simply because the process of changing from Blue Cross to Aetna didn't go so well. And so what I say as a part of this campaign, and in the spirit of service, as I meet teachers and firefighters and police officers and other state employees who are today using Blue Cross Blue Shield, knowing that Aetna is coming, I say to them, go tell your doctor today that Aetna is coming. And that if that doctor is not aware, call the state treasurer's office, call Aetna, get that transition going now, because the last thing we want to have happen is for people to be without health care day one when things go live in January. I'll also remind you and remind your audience that it's going to take somebody with that practical business experience who's operated customer service centers and marketing departments and that knows how to manage that kind of situation to be the best person for the job in that moment. You better bet that we're going to stand up some kind of rapid response call center or system that says, if you're going to your doctor and they don't take Aetna, but they used to take Blue Cross, call us. And we're going to find you another doctor immediately that takes Aetna in this case. Also, because you probably are accustomed to and like your preferred doctor, we're going to call them and make sure that they get expedited connection to Aetna so that they can ramp up coverage for you. So I'm going to be able to manage that with effectiveness and in a way that communicates to the public and to our retirees and state employees in an effective way so that we have the least amount of disruption and the most amount of positive healthcare experience for the people.
The word that comes to my mind is agility. We need leaders who have not just flexibility and creativity, but also agility, the ability to be able to respond in a very swift and mobile way, with competence, I might add, always with competence. A question occurred to me as I'm listening to you talking about the insurance company of the state moving from Blue Cross Blue Shield to Aetna, and maybe some of the uncertainty around how that happened. How do you avoid, Gabe, if elected to the office of state treasurer, how would you avoid, and how have you avoided in the past, conflicts of interests?
That's a very good question. Number one is to be transparent. Where conflicts exist, point them out. I think it's important to get ahead of those conflicts so that they don't create scenarios that are troubling to so many people, and therefore be proactive in identifying where conflicts exist and then ridding them as quickly as possible. And so, I will do my best to be as transparent and forward-thinking for any conflicts that might arise in my service as treasurer, but to do so with integrity and a set of values that aligns with the great people of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. You've talked a lot about your background, and I want to ask you about the changing demographic that we see in the state of North Carolina, which you've already alluded to. But talk to us about your impression of Latino political power in the state of North Carolina.
Well, let me first acknowledge that in the balance of our society for many, many years, there's always going to be imbalances. And for decades and centuries, that has been the case of African Americans. And it is on the shoulders of African American organizing and protesting and the quest for equality and power and influence that we have seen so much progress in the African American community, particularly here in the South and in Charlotte. And so I take that as an important example for what I'm about to tell you, which is Latino political power today is effectively zero. And I'm sad to say that because in our great state of North Carolina, there are 1.18 million Latinos, making up about just north of 11% of our population. And yet this million-sized population, this is 11% of the population, today has zero state house and state senate members of the General Assembly. Zero. How is it possible that a people the size of north of 1 million have no representation? That's not okay. That's not okay. And so we need to change that. If and when elected to the state treasurer's office, I would be the first Latino elected statewide in the history of North Carolina. I've told you so many things that I've done in the past. We were the first to do this and the first to do that, and my father and my family. And so this is nothing new, but it's important to acknowledge. Now, let me get practical about the Latino electorate. So of those 1.1, 1.2 million Latinos in the state, we are only 1/3 eligible to vote, about 400,000 people. And why do I say that? Because Latinos skew young, and not every Latino is yet a citizen and therefore eligible to vote. And so therefore, the base is not 1.2 million, it is 400,000. From there, Latinos under-index in registering to vote. We also under-index in going to the polls and actually voting. And so, for example, in the 2020, the last presidential election, only 150,000 Latinos voted off of a base of more than 1 million. And so that's a sad state of affairs when it comes to impact and political power and the quest for political power. But you know what? Your audience will know, Reverend, that in North Carolina, elections are won or lost by a few thousand, let alone a few hundred votes. Sadly, I'll remind everybody that Sherry Beasley lost by 400 some odd votes in her quest to remain state Supreme Court justice a few cycles ago. A few hundred. And so I don't need 1 million Latinos to come out to vote. I need a few extra thousand, let alone a few extra hundred net new voters, Latino voters. And so when I'm talking to the Latino community, the message is we are important. And in a state like North Carolina, our quest for political power in this case is equated to an enormous ability to make a difference at the end of the day. We could be the difference, the marginal difference in elections up and down the ballot, not only for me, for our governor's race, let alone in my conversations with my friend Julie Chavez Rodriguez in the presidential race, right? No pressure, Gabe, but go make that happen. Bring out Latino voters. So as a proud Mexican-American, bilingual, bicultural person, I am out in the Latino community. I am in Latino media channels in both English and in Spanish, and doing my best to make sure that Latinos feel represented, feel like we have a voice, and that we will be the difference. Now, I will also say as a part of that conversation is we can't do it alone. And in the history of how we get things done in this state, it is only through coalitions, through partnerships. In this case, I reach out to my African-American friends and say, let there be a Black-Brown coalition. To our Native American friends, the Eastern Band of Cherokee, the Lumbee, and so on and so forth through our Native American populations. Through our growing Indian community, South Asian community, Asian American community, all sorts. And by the way, this is not just on matters of race and ethnicity. I do believe it is important that while I'm running as a Democrat, to appeal to people wherever they might be on the political spectrum. Because as a business person, as somebody who has a public safety credential in fighting for technology to be deployed to our firefighters and police officers and 911 dispatchers and ambulance drivers, public safety is important to me. I didn't mention this along the way, Reverend, but I had the great opportunity to start a charter school during my time in the early 2000s living in New York. And we can debate how charter schools are doing and how we as Democrats feel about them and how we as North Carolinians are treating them today. But the point is, between being a business person, being an advocate for public safety, and believing in charter school choice, I have crossover appeal to that large group of unaffiliated voters and even some Republican voters to be able to say, I am the most electable candidate in this race because not only am I competent with the decades of experience in being able to do this particular job, but to be able to bring new coalitions of voters to the ballot, but also to appeal to as wide a swath of voters as possible. That's who I am. That's who I hope to be, and serve not just one particular slice of North Carolina, but all North Carolinians in making sure our prosperity is there, our jobs are there, and the long-term happiness and opportunity for our families are ensured.
I've got it. I've got it. Competence, building new coalitions, and long-term prosperity for Carolina. This is Gabe Esparza, everybody. He has been a marvelous, marvelous guest with us on Chop It Up NC tonight. I want to allow my good friend, Dr. Tobias DeGrone. Tobias, are you here?
I am here, my friend.
I want to give you a chance to respond before we close out tonight because you're so faithful in coming to these events. And it would be criminal to not allow you to speak and affirm the presence of our guest tonight.
The information shared tonight is insightful and it raises issues that those of us in the general public were not aware of in terms of the amount of pension that is available there in the state, and in terms of the importance of fiduciary responsibility in investment. So thank you. You are highly qualified, immensely qualified. And one of the things that I think resonates with me is that when you, and that separates you, is that when you relate to your own life experiences and your family's life experiences, it really resonates. It seals the deal. So thank you, Mr. Gabriel. Thank you for all the work you've done in leaving the private sector and all the benefits of the private sector and coming into the not-for-profit sector. So thank you. And thank you, Dr. McAllister and the Chop It Up team for hosting this. Very informative, and I have thoroughly enjoyed and have been very much informed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. By the way, I don't see it as not-for-profit. I see it as the service sector, public service. And so I appreciate your comments. And it is only through the longer form discussion platform, Reverend, that you are providing here for us today, that we can get into origin stories and families and motivations and planning. And so I appreciate you providing me with an opportunity to talk to you and your listeners in such an extended way. So thank you again.
It's been a pleasure, and we can't endorse. I have to say that again as a disclaimer. Those who are speaking as guests and who have been listening can express their favor all they wish. We cannot do that as a North Carolina Democratic Party, given the fact that we haven't had a primary. But I can assure you that if the North Carolina voters are listening tonight, you have heard an outstanding candidate, and you would not go wrong if you went in the direction of Gabe Esparza. That's not an endorsement. That's just an acknowledgement of what we've heard. And I think we can say that. We're going to have an opportunity to listen to your candidate who will bring on next year, early in the year, to offset anything that we may have done or said that would seem to be like a biased expression of favor or towards you, Gabe. But we've been happy to have you tonight. And if necessary, if you want to come back again next year, we'll be welcoming you and perhaps even having a little debate if you're interested in that type of conversation.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Thank you again, sir. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, that's it for tonight. Thank you. On December 10th, Sunday evening, we'll be talking with Judge Laura Covich. She's tried to be here a few times. She's officially filed for the North Carolina Supreme Court, so she'll be coming, and we look forward to having her on Sunday evening. Thank you, and good night.